In the last episode, we learned that Monson, the accused, was broke. He was bankrupt. But thanks to his friendship with young Cecil Hambrough, a man just months away from inheriting a fortune, Monson and his family were living the dream.
The estate of Ardlamont, the Glasgow News explains, is in the market for sale. It is an extensive and beautiful tract of country between Hambrough and Loch Fyne, and the passenger through the Cowls of Bute sees the southern extremity of it at the prominent portion of the northern mainland, familiar as Ardlamont Point.
The Monsons and Cecil had taken on the lease of a beautiful Scottish hunting estate, Ardlamont. They were in the process of buying a yacht, presumably so they could all enjoy sailing the picturesque Cowls of Bute, maybe pop across to Arran. But was it all too good to be true? Did the Monsons get greedy and try to kill off their golden goose before he came into his inheritance in exchange for a quick win with a couple of life insurance policies? Time to turn back to the forensic evidence to see if we can discover who pulled the trigger that killed Cecil Hambrough. Was it Monson, the elusive Scot, or Hambrough himself? Just a word of warning, there is some pretty graphic content coming up. I'm Pennie Stuart. This is Inside Forensic Science, the Ardlamont Mystery. Episode 5, The Experiments.
Dr. Henry Duncan Littlejohn, examined by the Solicitor General. I am Surgeon of Police and Lecturer in Medical Jurisprudence at the Surgeons' Hall, Edinburgh.
Just before we crack on, let's remind ourselves about the post-mortem from episode 3.
From the foregoing examination, we are of opinion that the deceased died from shock, the result of a gunshot injury of the skull and brain, and of subsequent loss of blood.
So is it now possible to work out how that gunshot injury occurred? Is it possible to sort of reverse engineer from where the shot ended up, to place the gun in the hands of whoever pulled the trigger and from where? Here's Dr. Littlejohn again, witness for the prosecution.
In ascertaining how an injury has been caused, there are certain matters familiar to doctors as aids to the determination of the question. In the first place, the direction of the wound is most important. In this case, the direction was from behind forward, and this I would conclude from the triangular shape of the wound in front, presenting this comparatively smooth, beveled appearance, gradually passing on and producing a larger amount of laceration. And finally, we have this condition of the ear, which, in my opinion, settles the question of the direction of the wound. The characteristics of the wound which I found in the skull were such as a wound from behind forward would lead me to expect. It appears to me, from the small number of pellets which we found in the brain, it was only the outside of the charge which inflicted the injuries we have described in the report.
I think it's quite important to try and picture this. Put your fingers on the area behind your right ear. That's where the wound was, and the gunshot hit Hambrough from behind. According to what we just heard from Littlejohn, only some of the pellets, the ones on the outside of the charge, hit the head. The rest take away a portion of his right ear and then carry on. This detail is key to what we're going to look at in this episode, so I hope that's clear. The first question we then need to ask is, could Cecil Hambrough have shot himself, either deliberately or by accident, to produce that wound? The trial doesn't consider suicide, so neither will we. So could this have been an accident? Is it possible that Hambrough has been walking along and, as Monson the accused has suggested, tripped and fell or caught the trigger on a branch and somehow the gun has gone off? The defence called Tom Speedy of Tom and James Speedy Shooting Agents. What jumped out about Speedy is how down-to-earth and easy to follow he is by comparison to some of the experts called for the prosecution. See what you think.
Tom Speedy. I'm a factor on the estate at Craigmillar. I have always taken a special interest in the subject of gun accidents. According to my experience, accidents with guns happen in the most inconceivable ways. I remember the case of a gentleman who was out shooting a year or two ago and who met with an accident. He felt himself falling and flung the gun from him. Accidents happen in the most inexplicable ways, and the shot, when the gun goes off accidentally, enters the body, to my knowledge, in the most unaccountable manner, by the crown of the head, the back of the neck, or the sole of the foot. The last mentioned case was one which came under my own personal knowledge. An Edinburgh gentleman let his gun fall. Both barrels went off, and one of the shots went through the sole of his foot horizontally. There was another man who I knew who shot himself in the palm of his hand, and the shot went up his arm.
According to Speedy, strange accidents can and do happen. George Andre, manager of Clyde Mills Company, which manufactured amberite gunpowder, which we talked about in episode 3, agrees.
It is quite possible that a man 6 feet high might accidentally shoot himself at a distance of nearly 6 feet, inflicting a wound in the head from behind, forwards. In the case of a novice, who is very apt to carry a gun carelessly, he might carry it in a position in which an accident might very well happen. Suppose he was carrying it 2 to 3 inches from the hammer and were to catch his foot in a rut or in a little hole and fall forwards, in all probability he would drop the gun. He would then fall forward and instinctively raise his head, as everyone does when falling, to prevent his face from striking the ground. In that position, the head would be more or less erect, and with the gun he might be shot from behind, forward, horizontally. The gun might be made to go off by coming in contact with the ground or by the shock of the fall. This is especially the case where there is no rebounding lock in the gun. That supposition commends itself to my mind as a reasonable possibility.
The defence also called on a number of witnesses who said Hambrough had a history of carrying his gun dangerously.
James Donald. Hambrough was explaining to those around him how an accident took place when he was carrying a gun. He said he was holding it about 18 inches from the muzzle, that it had gone off, and that he had had a narrow escape, the charge having gone close past his head. He said he had been carrying the gun in his usual way, with the stock near the ground and the barrel being in the air. He said that was how he generally carried his gun.
William Donald. I had a conversation with Hambrough about an accident he had had with a rook rifle he was carrying. He showed it to me. He said he'd been holding the gun in his usual way on the previous night, that the lock snapped and the gun went off past the side of his head. I know something of shooting, but I'm not an expert. I considered the way in which Hambrough carried his gun to be very dangerous.
Philip R. Day. I am Mrs. Monson's brother. I knew the late Lieutenant Hambrough very well and went out shooting with him on several occasions. I have noticed the way in which he carried his gun. He generally carried it at full cock when loaded, even when going through fences and plantations. I have remarked this to various people on several occasions. It struck me as peculiar. It made me uncomfortable and diffident about going out with him.
I asked deerstalker Duncan Mackenzie to demonstrate just what it was that Hambrough was doing which was so dangerous.
Okay, this is half cocked, so the hammers are there, sitting there, so I'm pulling the trigger, there's nothing happening.
Right.
The modern guns have a safety catch here, so when I cock that, did you see the hammer, keep your eye on that trigger, see it makes a wee jump?
Yep.
That's cocked.
So that means it's ready to...
It's good to go.
Ready to
I'm
fire.
going to open this to prove there's nothing in there.
Yep.
I'm now going to fire it. Okay.
Okay. So if he's walking around with it, I saw various reports in the trial papers saying, some say he walked around with it half cocked.
Yeah.
Some saying he walked around with it actually cocked.
Yeah.
If he was walking around with it cocked, he's ready to... It would be ready to fire.
It's ready to go, yeah. Now, the Mr. Donald fella, in the evidence, he said he was carrying it 18 inches from the end of the barrel. But
this was in a previous occasion, wasn't it, that he'd been witness doing this?
That was actually a rifle rather than a shotgun. So there's 18 inches. So I don't know how he was carrying it. He very, very strange anyway.
Yeah, and even if you're holding it, as you say, you're 6 feet tall,
yeah,
same height as Cecil,
yeah,
and if he's using it to be stomping on the ground,
yeah,
even so, the barrel of the gun is at most 2 feet away from you.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that's at a push.
Yeah.
It's probably a bit closer than that because the whole height of the length of the gun is actually a lot longer than I realised it's going to be. A shotgun's tall.
Yeah,
it's about 3 foot.
It's a big one. I'll just measure it. I've got a tape here.
Yep.
Put your finger on that.
Yep, I've got that.
So this shotgun is 1 metre 200, just under 4 feet.
So so I'm right. 2 foot is the very,
Yeah.
the distance it would be away
And
if you've got it resting on the ground as if it was a walking stick.
Yeah.
And it certainly couldn't reach
couldn't reach the hammers, nor the trigger.
hammers and the trigger.
And you see, the thing is, it's trying to get the shotgun around the back of your body to discharge that shot. And even although you get it round the back, you'd have to bend your head back at right angles.
What if, say he's walking along,
Yeah.
right? So we're walking along and he's
Yeah.
using it as a walking stick, walk.
Yeah.
It gets caught on something, right? Because we know it's rough ground.
Yeah.
So the trigger gets caught
Yeah.
and it's snagged. And we've walked past it
Yeah.
and he gives it a tug
Yeah.
and it pulls the trigger.
Yeah.
That's now behind you, isn't it?
Yeah. Even if he had it in his right hand, strangely, touched a bit of vegetation, that's going to blow his leg off. Or if it goes anywhere near his head, that head is gone. It's not on his body, it's in bits.
Duncan makes a really important point just there about just how much damage might be caused by a gun going off in such close proximity to the body. Pop that thought in your pocket, we're going to return to it just shortly. There's a video of Duncan demonstrating how difficult it appears to be to get a 4-foot-long shotgun into a position where you can shoot yourself in the back of the head. There's a link to it in the show notes, and it makes for interesting viewing. Rachel Sharp, our forensic firearms investigator, also had a go at this.
I must admit, I came back into the lab yesterday morning and I got a 12-bore hammered shotgun and we've got some skulls and I was like this, trying to see if I could put the gun in a position where it could have accidentally gone off. And there is a possibility that that could happen. And especially, they talked about a twig maybe or a bush catching on the trigger. Then that could happen. You can't rule that out. You can't rule, even if it wasn't accidental, if it was purposeful, that he used something to make his arm longer to pull the trigger. Not that it would be in that position. But there's lots of options that can be considered that I don't really think that the prosecution may be considered.
I hadn't considered them either. I have to admit I was quite surprised when Rachel told me that.
But the evidence that we have from McNaughton and pathology say this shot in the head was not consistent with accidental death because it's too far away. The mess in the skull is less than would be expected at 3 feet.
The underlying question to what Duncan's saying there is, what kind of wound would you get if someone shot themselves either by accident or design at close range? In order to answer this, experts for both the prosecution and the defence carried out an extensive number of experiments. And I mean extensive. A reminder, Hambrough was 6 feet tall. The 12-bore shotgun is 4 feet tall. Much of the focus of the experiments centres around what damage would be expected from a gun going off within 3 feet of a person. If you're working in metric, that's about 90 centimetres or under. James McNaughton, a gunmaker from Edinburgh, was called for the prosecution.
Right, this is James McNaughton. I go back to him. He's a really experienced guy.
Now, he's your gunsmith, isn't he?
He's the gun.
So he talks your language, does James McNaughton?
Yeah. Okay, this is. He was questioned by the Solicitor General, and he's replied, "Keeping control of the trigger." I'm quoting here from the court papers. Keeping control of the trigger.
Of the trigger at the same time. He could only hold it at a very short distance off, A very long-armed man might keep the muzzle 5 or 6 inches from his head. Apart from having his finger on the trigger guard, he could hold it the length of his arm. He could hold the gun by the muzzle. Judging from my experiments, the result of a shot fired within 3 feet would have been that a hole about 1 1/4 inches would have been driven through the skull, if not along the side of it. If there on the skull, a hole of 1 1/4 inches would have been driven through the skull, and the shot going like a ball in at that distance would go through the head and shatter the skull at the other side. At this distance, I have been shown by my experiments, there are no stray pellets. Judging from my experiments and the injuries to the head, which I saw, I am unable to see the possibility of the wound having been self-inflicted, accidental or otherwise.
And I agree entirely with that.
So, our dear stalker Duncan and gunsmith McNaughton for the prosecution say under 3 feet, and there would be much more damage to the head than was seen in the post-mortem. Dr. Saunders, who attended the post-mortem on behalf of the defence, also carried out a long and extensive range of experiments with another expert, Professor Hay. Here's what Saunders and Hay conclude.
Experiments were first made for the purpose of showing the size and the shape and the character of a wound made by the guns. In question in this case with shot, point blank, at various distances. The experiments on the wooden boards were made to determine the character and the size of the hole and the various surrounding parts as the result of shots at various distances. They were also made to show the scattering and dispersion and the extent of blackening and singeing and, incidentally, the size of the central hole made by the shot. From these experiments, I inferred that the shot which killed Mr. Hambrough was fired from such a distance that there were no scattered pellet marks, and that the central hole or opening was of the diameter which I have shown on the diagram hanging here in court. I put the muzzle of the gun at a distance from the head of probably under 3 feet and certainly not over 4.
So Saunders and Hay say Hambrough was shot from probably under 3 feet, certainly not over 4. Dr. Macmillan, remember him? He was the GP from Hambrough back in episode 1, who was first called to the scene and initially signed off the death as accidental, then later changed his mind. He also conducted experiments and witnessed the experiments of others. Here's what he had to say.
I have since taken guns of different lengths and tried them in every possible position and way and found it absolutely impossible to produce a wound of this kind. What led me to alter my opinion was the fact that the wound was not so extensive, nor was the destruction of bone so great as it would have been had the shot been fired at a short distance. At 12 inches, I should expect the head to be blown to bits. I do not expect that at 12 inches a shot will be much deflected. If you hit the head at that distance, there would be bound to be a great deal of smashing of bone, whatever the angle. I made experiments on sheep heads. I tried to get a wound resembling that on Mr. Hambrough's head by letting the shot touch the head as little as possible. At the near range, the head was all smashed up. I have witnessed the results of experiments upon the cadaver in Edinburgh. I have descriptions of the direction of the gun from those who carried out the experiments, one of whom was Mr. McNaughton. I found that in every case, whatever angle he fired at, the substance fired at was blown away. The shot fired at the near range resulted in a complete smash.
So the GP, Dr. Macmillan, now says it can't have been a shot at close range. Just a thought. Remember back in episode 1, Dr. Macmillan admitted prior to this case he'd never seen a gunshot wound to the head. So how good an expert witness is he? Even if he's keen to understand what happened in those woods with Hambrough, Scott and Monson. Dr. Macmillan wanted to get to the truth of this. But to what extent is he part of a kind of a history of GPs actually doing research and being curious and asking those kind of questions?
I think there is a culture of that. So Dr. Jim Douglas, during the COVID pandemic, was questioning the effectiveness of the PPE that GPs were being issued. And actually, with his experience in occupational health, which was another thread to his general practice work, was able to do tests, and tests which actually seemed to support his feeling that the PPE was not viable. And I think we should give credit to the doctors who are prepared to look into that and to ask those questions. It's a shame there's not more support for GPs to do research, because I think we have a great opportunity to do that. But unfortunately, it tends to be left to GPs to do that in their own time, at their own expense, rather than as part of established research things, unless you're fortunate enough to be one of the very few GPs who are involved in academic general practice. So there is that basis of that. And there was Dr. John MacLeod in Uist, who interestingly had a lot wider range of activities, and one of those was to examine deaths from the fishing industry. And actually him who's made the link that actually people were drowning. And when he examined the bodies, he realised that flies of the trousers were down, and realised actually what had happened was that the fisherman had gone to pee over the side. And repeatedly over times, he realised that the major cause of death in the fishing industry was from people peeing over the side and slipping and falling. And actually, the work of John MacLeod was recognised by the fishing industry, actually by the campaign "Don't Die for a Pee." Actually, the business of going to the toilet safely and wearing life jackets was a major campaign and had an effect on mortality. So there are these examples of GPs getting involved in this work. These two doctors, for me, I think epitomise of what we should be doing, but unfortunately there are opportunities to do that are less and less as we all get busier and busier. But I think that business about being inquisitive and trying to find patterns in life is very much part of the sort of the blood of general practice.
Dr. Miles Mack, GP. I realise we've gone herring off at a tangent, but I think these points of change and difference are worth noting along the way. Back to all these experiments. So far, we've got experts for the defence saying he was shot from under 3 feet, not more than 4. McNaughton and Littlejohn for the prosecution disagree.
Littlejohn, any distance under 3 feet, the injuries were dissimilar from what we found in the case of the deceased. So this was him practising on cadavers. So they were taking dead bodies from London and blasting them in the head, which is incredible too, isn't it? I would be therefore inclined to place the possible distance between 3 feet and 15 feet. Okay, so that leaves it open. In all the experiments we made, the wounds at 9 feet present the closest similarity to the injuries we found on the deceased's head. Any distance under 3 feet would be inconsistent to what we found on the skull. The injuries were something frightful under 3 feet. The head was blown to pieces. Now that's what I've seen, the scenes I go to or I've been to.
So who do you believe? The experiments didn't stop there, so don't make your mind up just yet. One way of possibly working out the distance Hambrough has been shot from is to try and work out what the shot pattern is doing. Let's remind ourselves what Dr. Littlejohn said about the shot pattern and the wound.
It appears to me, from the small number of pellets which we found in the brain, it was only the outside of the charge which inflicted the injuries we have described in the report.
The post-mortem suggests that only the outside of the shot causes the wound to the head. The rest of the shot goes through the ear, which is why a portion of that is missing, then continues on its way into the surrounding vegetation. The reason that's important is if we know at what point pellets start to spread out and how, after they've been fired, that might give us more information about what distance Hambrough was shot from.
So shotguns are designed, unlike other types of handguns, they're designed to discharge lots of projectiles at once. So they have a cartridge case that's loaded with lots of small lead balls. And so the idea is that when the shot is discharged from the gun, it starts to spread out and you've got more chance of hitting smaller targets from further away, so game, rabbits, birds, that sort of thing. The further away you get from a target, the small balls would spread. This is key to how far away the discharge was taken. Pellets generally, from much research, have been devised that they would separate from 3 feet onwards. So anything within 3 feet, you would expect to maybe see just a single hole and a small, maybe the odd flying pellet or the scallop shape around the wound, but further than 3 feet, then they would start to spread, which is very consistent with what a lot of the experts say here. And even the gunmaker says, 3 to 4 feet, but then all of a sudden comes up with 9 feet. For no reason whatsoever. The pathologists on the prosecution side come up with further than 3 feet because we get no spreading, but could be anywhere from that to 15 feet because they took their information from the cadavers that they found. And that was something we would very much do. We would take test shots with the ammunition, with the gun, and to see which pattern looked the most similar. So I understand that, and we would always give a range now as well. We wouldn't be specific with a distance.
Okay, so the end of my barrels is there.
Okay, so that's 3 feet.
Yeah.
And so basically you've got a piece of paper with a target on it, and we're just wanting to see what the pattern is like.
See what the hole is like.
Okay.
To see if there's any significant difference between 3 feet and 9 feet.
Okay. So you're going to load up the gun. I'm going to go and step back to a distance. I'll tell you when I'm clear.
Okay.
And we're good to go.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, Dan, clear. That was from 3 feet. And explain what we've got on our paper here.
Well, you can stand on that.
Yeah.
You can see the hole behind.
Oh gosh, yeah, in the bank.
See the lead? See the pellets?
Yep.
So there's our mass there. What's that? 30 mil. So if you imagine poor Mr. Hambrough doing himself an injury at 3 feet, with that amount of mass, there's no pellets going to go near a tree. It's all in his nut. It's all in his head.
In the trial, a lot is made of the damage to trees in the vicinity where Hambrough was shot. 3 trees in particular, a rowan, beech and a lime. You'll find all these detailed on James Brand, the surveyor's drawings, which you'll get a link to in the show notes.
James Brand. The locus of the accident on 10th August is indicated by the letters J, K, L, M, O on the smaller section of the plan, which is not large enough to allow of my marking these points. J marks the spot where Mr. Hambrough's head was when he was found dead. K is a rowan tree and is marked from actual survey. L is a branch of a beech tree and M is the stem of a lime tree. The branches of the lime and of the beech tree overlapped at the point L. The distance from the point J, where Mr. Hambrough's head was lying, to the rowan tree K is 6 feet 6 inches. From K to L, the distance is 13 feet 9 inches. From K to M, that is from the rowan tree to the stem of the lime tree, the distance is 16 feet 3 inches. To mark the parts of the rowan tree which were broken off by the pellets, I took little pieces of paper and tied them onto the branches underneath the brakes. I then took the beech tree and found a pellet mark on a branch 8 feet 8 inches above the ground. And on the lime tree, I found a pellet mark 7 feet 8 inches and another 6 feet 8 inches above the ground.
It suggested that the trees might have been damaged by the shot which killed Hambrough. By noting the pattern and position of shot damage in the trees, you might then learn more about where the shot came from. I want you to place yourself in the position of the jury now and brace yourself for another detail overload. Just imagine how they felt when they heard this from James McNaughton for the prosecution.
I saw where the body of Mr. Hambrough had been lying. According to my measurements, it was 6 feet 1 inch from the root of the rowan tree. Measuring from the head, supposing that the man was found lying and that he was shot at from behind, I should expect him to have been standing some 5 feet further from the rowan tree. It depends upon his height, and Hambrough was about 6 feet. I think that as a shot has a pushing as well as a penetrating effect, it would, coming from behind, make him fall forward. If he were a man of 6 feet, he might fall his own length.
And if your brain hasn't melted by now, you're a better jury member than me. Here's the Reader's Digest version. Take note of where Hambrough was alleged to have been found. Look at pellet damage in the trees beyond him. Take what we know about pellet dispersal from a shotgun and work backwards with lots of measuring tape and head scratching until you come up with a place you believe the shot must have been fired from.
When I was on the ground, I made up my mind as to a point 22 feet from the rowan tree.
So much was made of this in the trial, they actually went and cut down the trees and brought them into the courtroom. I kid you not. Something which Rachel says is pretty much useless as evidence.
Unless it's been completely documented with photographs and video, like it would be in today's crime scene investigation, then nobody else can comment then once they're moved. They're not. It's not in situ. So, it needs to be documented exactly which way it was taken off the tree, and because once you've got a twig with a hole through it, which way did it go? I know. So yeah, very difficult. And yeah, those sort of things I think would only be of value if they were looked at in situ.
Duncan's experiment showed there was no shot dispersal at 3 feet. Let's have a look at what happens at 9 feet, the distance gunsmith McNaughton comes up with based on all the above calculations. OK, Dan, come clear. So a bit of difference here.
A bit of difference there, yeah.
Explain what we're seeing now.
Well, this is at 9 feet and with more spread, but the main hole is almost the same.
You've got a slightly different pattern there. The hole in the middle is the same,
yeah.
But then on the 9 feet one, you've got shot all around the place. So yeah. I guess the fact that they were going on and on about there being shot in the trees,
yeah.
From 9 feet, it looks like you could potentially have had shot going into the rowan, the beech, the lime, whatever was there.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyone listening to this who wants to see the pictures of these little experiments we're doing, there will be a link to all of this in the show notes.
In the evidence it says, there's one man there, it says there, this is balderdash, and he's bang on, absolutely bang on.
Which bit's balderdash?
The shot got into the trees. Because, I mean, if you go to a clay pigeon shooting ground, for instance, and there's trees there, it is absolutely peppered with lead, everything is covered in lead. That estate would have had thousands of rounds getting fired at it all the time. They'd be shooting at, as I said, blackbirds, ospreys, you name it, it'd be flattened.
If you had shot recently into trees, we've got a whole lot of trees here in front of us in the estate, okay? So say we'd shot into those trees or this was a shooting area that we were at and it was had peppered. It was peppered with shot wounds on the trees.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be able to go up there and say, that's a new wound, that's an old wound, that's a new wound in the tree, that's an old wound in the tree?
Again, it would depend on the time of the year. We're talking August, but they only got round to it in October to look for these things. There would be the vegetation on the tree. The leaf would be dying back anyway. It'd be a natural dieback. If you got there in August and you saw a fresh little pellet hole in a leaf, you would say that's very fresh. But the fact still remains that they were shooting all the time.
And they continued shooting even in the days, I think, after Hambrough died, because it's a shooting estate.
Yeah, it's this vegetation evidence, for me, for my money, is nonsense.
I looked to see if there were any other trees to uproot. It was upon my assumption as to the place where the man had been shot that I looked at the trees. I made no examination of the trees except those that were of importance in the inquiry if the place where the man was shot was accurately described to me. It would have taken me a year to have gone over all the trees. There might have been a good many pellets found in the trees with people shooting winged game. I was informed that this was a favourite cover for Ardlamont. The authorities did not lay before me that this was a wood very much shot in. Nor was I aware that Mr. Hambrough had shot frequently, almost daily there, especially shooting wood pigeons.
And a lot of the witnesses said there was shot patterns on all the trees, and how do we associate that shot pattern to actually the wound or the shot that's caused the wound as well? I mean, that's a really difficult thing to do. But without seeing the wound and without seeing that pattern, then I can't make much more comment on that. Sometimes you see something and it's like, well, that's really obvious that was made. That's quite a fresh break in bark, break in the trees, or that the fact that it was all in a line is quite significant, because you could maybe look at all the other patterns in the surrounding area and try and associate them to other damage, and imagine that the accused was standing in line with those. Would that work? Yeah, that's the sort of things I think you need to be looking at in this case to actually say that damage was definitely related to that injury, or the shot that caused that injury. But it does seem quite a stretch that they've come to.
So 2 things worry me here. One is that we only have, in terms of where he was shot, the only person we have telling us that is the accused. Mm-hmm. And to what extent am I right in thinking that if he gives the wrong information about where this took place, doesn't that mean all your calculations are off?
It does, yes. And I think that was what the battle was in this trial, is that all the experts are basing a lot of their information on hearsay, and any change in that information would change the results, and that's got to be said, which, to be fair, a lot of the witnesses did say that if any of these measurements or whatever, any of this information that I was given to start with was different, my results would be different. But it then brings into question, then, can we use their information if it's just based on hearsay? A lot of the time, if I was giving evidence in a similar case, we would definitely put a proviso in that there are other situations that are to be considered. This is one situation that I can see how it could have happened, or it is consistent with the things that I found, but I can't rule out that another scenario might come up that fits the information and the evidence that's been recovered.
Another thing that strikes me from looking at all this is it's quite a long time after the shooting takes place until the experts are at the scene and looking at the surrounds. Does that throw up particular problems in terms of of gathering evidence too? And if so, what kind of challenges does the time frame present?
Huge concerns as well, because a crime scene is like a jigsaw, and as soon as you remove pieces, it's much harder to work out what the picture is. So as soon as that body was removed out of that scene, the scene's not the same anymore. So yeah, you've got to start making assumptions. And once you bring in the assumptions, that's when there's doubt can be cast on your opinions.
And doubt certainly was cast on the opinions of the experts in this case, particularly the opinions of the prosecution. Reading through the transcript of the trial, I found the noise created by the vast array of experiments and experts pretty baffling.
I made shooting experiments with both guns. The experiments with the cardboard at 9 feet were made with the gun fair on the flat surface. To that extent, they differ from actual circumstances in the case.
As regards the results of experiments made by the witnesses for the Crown upon the heads of dead human bodies, I think
I have descriptions of the direction of the gun from those who carried out the experiments, one of whom was Mr. McNaughton.
The entrance of the shot, as shown on the wooden head, corresponds in appearance, as far as one can have a resemblance between wood and an ordinary head, with the wound on Mr. Hambrough's head.
I see that in my specimens there is considerable scattering outside the circumference of the wound. I saw nothing of this.
I was present at the experiments made by Mr. McNaughton with the two Ardlamont guns, and I have seen and examined the cardboard.
We made experiments from the exact bottom of the ditch. The dyke at this point was quite narrow, and the height from the opposite side of the ditch in the young plantation was measured and was found to be 4 feet above the level
My
of
wife
the
came
ditch.
out and took down her hair, and I fired a shot at 2 feet distance through her hair with a full cartridge of ambrite powder, and it did not singe it. It did not even leave a smell of it.
And yes, you heard right, one of the experiments even involved Tom Speedy shooting through his wife's hair. As a jury, how are we supposed to pick through all that detail to come up with some kind of conclusion? How do we even know that the experiments being conducted, Tom Speedy, I'm looking at you here, are robust, trustworthy, believable science? Somehow, we've got to come up with a verdict on all this. What do you think? Is Monson guilty, not guilty, or not proven of the charge of murdering Cecil Hambrough? And just how concerned should we be that we've never even seen, let alone heard from the mysterious Scot? Even if you think the evidence points to Hambrough having been shot at a distance, have you heard anything which suggests that it must have been Monson rather than Scot who pulled the trigger?
In a proper trial, you'd have used one against the other to give evidence, and one of them would have been jailed or hung.
Wow, we didn't have Scot though.
No.
He's out the picture.
He was a monkey.
He was certainly a missing monkey, but not missing for that much longer, because he's going to make an appearance in our next and final episode, when you get to decide if you're siding with Duncan, who clearly has Monson pinned for murder, or have come up with a different verdict. In episode 5 of the Ardlamont mystery, the experts were Duncan Mackenzie, Rachel Sharp and Dr. Miles Mack. The actors were Pam McIntosh, David Stenhouse, Alan Richardson, Kenny Smith, Donald Peterkin, Andrew Thompson, Craig Swan, Ian Boffey, Mark Stephen, Joe Riley, Dan Holland, Chris Dolan and Andrew Lever. Inside Forensic Science is written and presented by me, Pennie Stuart. The story consultants and series researchers are Heather Duran and Clara Morris. The sound mix is by Steve Bull. Inside Forensic Science, the Ardlamont Mystery is an Adventurous audio production for the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee and is funded by the Leverhulme Trust.